Part 2, Chapter 5 of The Dead Letter by Metta Victoria Fuller Victor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. On the Trail. I need not dwell at much length upon our visit to San Francisco, since nothing important to the success of our enterprise came of it. From the hour we entered the Golden Gate till we departed through it, I was restless with a solicitude which made me nervous and sleepless, destroyed my appetite, and blinded me to half the novelties of San Francisco, with its unparalleled growth and hybrid civilization. I gave the most of my time to two objects, looking by night into all the bad, popular, or out-of-the-way dens, haunts, saloons, theaters, and hotels, scanning every one of the thousands of strange faces for that one sinister countenance which I felt that I could know at a glance, and in the endeavor to identify the man who had disposed of the Park Bank bill to the express company. I was rewarded, for days of research, by ascertaining finally and beyond doubt that a gentleman of respectability, a Spaniard, still residing in the city, had offered the bill to be discounted at the time it had been accepted by the company. I made the acquaintance of the Spanish gentleman, and, with a delicacy of address upon which I flattered myself, I managed to learn, without being too impertinent, that he had obliged a fellow passenger, 2 years previously, who was getting off at Acapulco, and who desired gold for his paper money, with the specie, and had taken of him some $2,000 or $3,000 of New York currency, which he had disposed of to the express company. Burton was right, then. My heart leaped to my throat as the gentleman mentioned Acapulco. From that moment I felt less fear of failure, but more, if possible, intense curiosity and anxiety. It had been my intention to proceed to Sacramento in search of the haunting face which was forever gliding before my mind's eye, but, after this revelation, I gladly yielded to the belief that Mr. Burton would find the face before I did, and in the relief consequent upon this hope, I began to give more heed to his injunction to do my part of the duty by taking good care of his child. Lenore was in rising health and spirits, and when I began to exert myself to help her pass away the time, she grew very happy. The confiding dependence of childhood is its most affecting trait. It was enough for her that her father had given her to me for the present. She felt safe and joyous, and made all those little demands upon my attention which a sister asks of an older brother. I could hardly realize that she was nearly 13 years of age. She remained so small and slender, and was so innocently childlike in her manners and feelings. Her attendant was one of those active women who like nothing so much as plenty of business responsibility. The trip, to her, was full of the kind of excitement she preferred. The entire charge of the little maiden entrusted to her care was one of the most delightful accidents that had ever happened to her. I believe she rejoiced daily in the absence of Mr. Burton, simply because it added to the importance of her duties. But I was glad when the fortnight's long delay was over and we were re-embarked upon our journey. My mind lived in advance of the hour, dwelling upon the moment when I should either see, awaiting us on the dock, where he had promised to meet us, at the Isthmus, the familiar form of the good genius of our party, or that blank which would announce tidings of fatal evil. We glided prosperously over the rounded swells of the Pacific, through sunshiny days and nights of brilliant moonlight. Through the soft evenings, Lenore, well wrapped in shawls and hood by her faithful woman, remained with me upon the deck, sometimes until quite late, singing, one after another, those delicious melodies never more subtly, understandingly rendered than by this small spirit of song. Rapt crowds would gather at respectful distances to listen, but she sung for my sake and for the music's, unheeding who came or went. Sometimes, even now, I wake at night from a dream of that voyage, with the long wake of glittering silver following the ship, as if a million Peris, in their boats of pearl, were sailing after us, drawn on by the enchantment of the pure voice which rose and fell between stars and sea. The last 24 hours before reaching the Isthmus witnessed a change in the long stretch of brilliant weather common at that season of the year. Torrents of rain began to fall, and continued hour after hour, shutting us in the cabin and surrounding us with a gray wall, which was as if some solid world had closed us in, and we were never more to see blue sky, thin air, or the sharp rays of the sun. Lenore, wearied of the monotony, at length fell asleep on one of the sofas, and I was glad to have her quiet, for she had been restless at the prospect of seeing her father early the next morning. It was expected the steamer would reach her dock some time after midnight. As the hours of the day and evening wore on, I grew so impatient as to feel suffocated by the narrow bounds of the ship and the close gray tent of clouds. Lenore went early to her stateroom. I borrowed a waterproof cloak from one of the officers of the vessel, and walked the decks the whole night, in the driving rain, for I could not breathe in my little room. It was so possible, so probable, that harm had befallen the solitary detective setting forth, a stranger in a strange land, upon his dangerous errand, that I blamed myself bitterly for yielding to his wishes, and allowing him to remain at Acapulco. In order to comfort myself, I recalled his ability to cope with danger, his physical strength, his unshaken coolness of nerve and mind, his calmness of purpose and indomitable will, before which the wills of other men were broken like reeds by a strong wind. The incessant rain recalled 2 other memorable nights to me, and the association did not serve to make me more cheerful. There was no wind whatever with the rain. The captain assured me, after I had asked him often enough to vex a less question-inured officer for the 20th time, that we were all right, not a half hour after time, would arrive at the isthmus at 2:00 a.m. precisely, and I might go to bed in peace, and be ready to get up early in the morning. I had no idea of going to bed. The passengers were not to be disturbed until daylight, but I was too anxious to think of sleep. I said to myself that if Mr. Burton was as impatient as myself, he would, despite the storm and the late hour, be upon the dock awaiting our arrival, and if so, he should not find me slumbering. As we neared our landing, I crowded in among the sailors at the forward part of the boat, and strained my eyes through the gloom to the little twinkle of light given out by the lamps along the quay. As usual, there was considerable stir and noise upon the arrival of the steamer, shouts from the ship and shore, and a bustle of ropes and swearing of sailors. The passengers generally were snug in their berths, where they remained until morning. In a few moments the ropes were cast ashore, and we were moored to our dock. I leaned over the gunwale and peered through the mist. The rain had kindly ceased descending for the time. Various lamps and lanterns glimmered along the wharf, where some persons were busy about their work pertaining to the arrival of the ship, but I looked in vain for Mr. Burton. Disappointed, despondent, I still reconnoitered the various groups, when a loud, cheery voice called out, "Richard, halloo!" I experienced a welcome revulsion of feeling as these pleasant tones startled me to the consciousness that Mr. Burton had emerged from the shadow of a lamp-post, against which he had been leaning, and was now almost within shaking hands distance. I could have laughed or cried, whichever happened, as I recognized the familiar voice and form. Presently he was on the vessel. The squeeze I gave his hand when we met must have been severe, for he winced under it. I scarcely needed to say, "You have been successful," or he to answer. There was a light on his face which assured me that at least he had not entirely failed. "I have much, much to tell you, Richard. But first about my darling. Is she well? Happy?" "Both. We have not had an accident. You will be surprised to see Lenore. She has improved so rapidly. My heart feels 1,000 pounds lighter than it did an hour ago." "Why so?" "Oh, I was so afraid you had not got away from Acapulco." "You do look pale, that's a fact, Richard. As if you had not slept for a week. Let your mind rest in peace, my friend. All is right. The trip has not been wasted. Now let God give us favoring breezes home, and 2 years of honest effort shall be rewarded. Justice shall be done. The wicked in high places shall be brought low." He always spoke as if impressed with an awful sense of his responsibility in bringing the inequities of the favored rich to light, and on this occasion his expression was unusually earnest. "Where is my little girl? What is the number of her stateroom? I would like to steal a kiss before she wakes. But I suppose that careful Marie has the door bolted and barred, so I will not disturb them. It is 3 whole hours to daylight yet. I can tell you the whole story of my adventures in that time, and I suppose you have a right to hear it as soon as possible. I will not keep you in suspense. Come into the cabin." We found a quiet corner where, in the wee sma' hours, by the dim light of the cabin lamps, now nearly out, I listened, it is needless to say, with what painful interest, to the account of Mr. Burton's visit in Mexico. I will give the history here as he gave it, with the same reservations which, it was evident, he still made in talking with me. These reservations, which I could not fail to perceive he had frequently made since the beginning of our acquaintance, and which, the reader will recollect, had at times excited my indignation, puzzled and annoyed me, but there was soon to come a time when I understood and appreciated them. On that day of our outward voyage, when the ship was detained to land a portion of her passengers at Acapulco, Mr. Burton, restless at the delay, was leaning over the deck rails, thrumming impatiently with his fingers, when his attention became gradually absorbed in the conversation of a group of Mexicans at his elbow, several of whom were of the party about to land. They spoke the corrupted Spanish of their country, but the listener understood it well enough to comprehend the most of what was said. One of their number was describing a scene which occurred upon his landing at this same port some 2 years previous. The ship, bound for San Francisco, met with an accident and put into Acapulco for repairs. The passengers, knowing the steamer would not sail under 24 hours, the most of them broke the monotony of the delay by going on shore. A number of rough New Yorkers, going out to the mines, got into a quarrel with some of the natives, during which knives, pistols, etc., were freely used. A gentleman named Don Miguel, the owner of a large and valuable hacienda which lay about 30 miles from Acapulco, and who had just landed from the steamer, attempted imprudently to interfere, not wishing his countrymen to be so touchy with their visitors, and was rewarded for his good intentions by receiving a severe stab in the side from one of the combatants. He bled profusely, and would soon have become exhausted, had not his wound been immediately and well dressed by a young American, one of the New York passengers, who had landed to see the sights, and was standing idly to one side, viewing the mêlée at the time Don Miguel was injured. The Don, exceedingly grateful for the timely attention, conceived a warm liking for the young man, whose Yankee quickness and readiness had attracted his attention while on board the steamer. Having given such proof of his fitness for the place as he had done by dressing the Don's wound, that gentleman, in the course of the 2 or 3 hours in which the young stranger remained in attendance upon him, offered him the situation of physician upon his immense estates, with the plain promise that he should receive benefits much more important than his salary. This offer, after a short hesitation, was accepted by the doctor, who stated that he was out in search of his fortune, and it made no difference to him where he found it, whether in Mexico or California, only that he should be assured of doing well. This Don Miguel, in his sudden friendship, was prompt to promise. The Don, besides vast grazing farms, had extensive interest in the silver mines which bordered upon his hacienda. Dr. Seltzer was deeply interested in an account of these, and returned to the ship for his baggage, bidding his fellow passengers good-bye in excellent spirits. And well he might consider himself fortunate, continued the narrator, for there are none of us who do not feel honored by the friendship of Don Miguel, who is as honorable as he is wealthy. For my part, I do not understand how he came to place such confidence in the Yankee doctor, who had to me the air of an adventurer. But he took him to his home, made him a member of his family, and before I left Acapulco, I heard Don Miguel had given him for a wife his only daughter, a beautiful girl who could have had her choice of the proudest young bloods in this region. It may be imagined with what interest Mr. Burton listened to the story thus unconsciously revealed by the chatty Mexican. He at once, as by prescience, saw his man in this fortunate Dr. Seltzer, who had registered his name Mr., not Doctor, on the passenger list, and whose name was among those that the detective had selected as suspicious. I interrupted my friend's narrative here to explain the matter of the banknotes which he had exchanged for specie with a passenger, but found that Mr. Burton already knew all about them. Edging gradually into the conversation, Mr. Burton, with his tact and experience, was not long in drawing from the group a description of the personal appearance of Dr. Seltzer, along with all the facts and conjectures relating to his history since his connection with Don Miguel. Everything he heard made assurance doubly sure, and there was no time to be lost in deciding upon the course to be pursued in this unexpected doubling of the chase. To get off at Acapulco was a matter of course, but what to do with the remainder of his party he could not at first determine. He knew that I would be eager to accompany him, yet he feared that, in some way, should we all land and take rooms at any of the hotels, the wily Dr. Seltzer, doubtless always on the alert, might perceive some cause for alarm, and secure safety by flight. To go alone, under an assumed name, in the character of a scientific explorer of mines, seemed to him the surest and most discreet method of nearing the game, and to this resolve he had come before he sought us out to announce his intention of stopping at Acapulco, while leaving us to pursue our voyage without him. End of Part 2, Chapter 5. Part 2, Chapter 6 of The Dead Letter by Metta Victoria Fuller Victor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. At last, at last. As our ship steered away out into the open sea, Mr. Burton walked up into the ruinous old Spanish town and stopped at the hotel, in whose breezy corridor he found several of his traveling companions who had preceded him. These persons had been somewhat surprised at his desertion of the rest of his party for a visit to their decayed city. But when he explained to them his desire of visiting some of their deserted mines, and examining the character of the mountainous region, a little back, before proceeding to similar investigations in California, their wonder gave place to the habitual indolence of temperaments hardly active enough for curiosity. There were 2 or 3 persons from the United States stopping at the hotel who quickly made his acquaintance, eager for news direct from home, and while he conversed with these, the 4 o'clock dinner was announced. He sipped his chocolate leisurely after the dessert, chatting at ease with his new friends, and upon expressing a desire to see more of the old town, one of them offered to accompany him upon a walk. They strolled out among cool palm groves and back through the dilapidated streets, made picturesque by some processions of Catholics winding through the twilight with their torches, until the moon arose and glimmered on the restless ocean. Most persons, on business similar to Mr. Burton's, would have gone at once to the American consul for his assistance, but he felt himself fully equal to the emergency, and desired no aid in the enterprise which he was about to prosecute. Therefore, he refused the invitation of his companion to call upon the consul, and finally returned to his hotel to sit awhile in the open, moonlit corridor before retiring to his room, where he lay long awake, pondering upon the steps to be taken next day, and somewhat disturbed by the open doors and windows which were the order of the establishment. He was awakened from his first slumber by the cold nose of a dog rubbed in his face, and from his second by a lizard creeping over him. But not being a nervous man, he contrived to sleep soundly at last. He was served early in the morning with a cup of coffee in his apartment, and before the late breakfast was ready, he had been abroad and concluded his arrangements for a visit to the estates of Don Miguel. Everybody knew that gentleman by reputation, and he had no difficulty in securing the services of 2 half-naked, lazy-looking native Indians to act as guides, who, with 3 forlorn mules, destined to carry the party, were at the door when he finished his repast. He was warned to go well armed, as, though the route to Don Miguel's was an old one, often traveled, there was always more or less danger in that country. A pistol or 2 would not be out of place, if only to keep his shiftless guides in order. Mr. Burton thanked his advisers, told them he feared nothing, and set out upon his long, hot, and tedious ride, 30 miles on muleback under a southern sun, being somewhat more of a task than he had ever known a journey of that length to be hitherto. At noon he took a rest of a couple of hours at a miserable inn by the wayside, and a dinner of fried tortillas, rendered tolerable by a dessert of limes, bananas, and oranges. With a supply of this cooling fruit in his pockets, he braved the afternoon sun, determined to reach the hacienda before dark. As he neared his destination, the character of the country changed. The broad road, cut through groves of palm and fields of corn, with orchards of figs and peaches, grew more narrow and uneven, and the surface of the ground more broken. Before him loomed up hills, growing higher as they retreated, some of the glittering peaks seeming to glisten with snow. A cool, refreshing air swept down from them. The scenery, although wilder, was beautiful and romantic in the extreme. Wearied as he was with the conduct of a mule which was no disgrace to the reputation of its species, Mr. Burton enjoyed the magnificent scene which opened before him as he approached the hacienda of Don Miguel. It lay at the foot of a low mountain, first of the brotherhood which overtopped it, and stood looking over its shoulder. Rich plains, some of them highly cultivated, and others covered with grazing herds of 1,000 cattle, lay at the foot of the hill, which was heavily timbered, and down which leaped a sparkling cascade, not more beautiful to the eye than promising of freshness to the pastures below, and of water privileges to the mines understood to lay somewhere in the cañons of the mountain. Before entering upon the estates which he had now reached, Mr. Burton secured a night's lodging for his peons at a hovel by the roadside, and having abundantly rewarded them, dismissed them from his service, riding forward alone along the private carriageway, which, through groves of flowering trees and fragrant peach orchards, led up to the long, low, spacious mansion of Don Miguel. By the servant who came forth to receive him, he was informed that the master of the place was at home, and was soon shown into his presence in the cool, tile-floored sitting-room, in which he was lounging, waiting for the supper hour. Mr. Burton's powers of pleasing were too great, and his refinement too real, for him to fail in making the impression he desired upon the gentleman into whose house he had intruded himself. The cold courtesy with which he was at first received soon took a tinge of warmth, and it was with sincere cordiality that Don Miguel offered him the hospitalities of his home, and full liberty to make all the researches he might desire upon his estate. The habitual dislike of the Spaniard for Los Yankees seemed quite overcome in the case of Don Miguel, by his friendship for his son-in-law, of whom he soon spoke, anticipating the pleasure it would give Dr. Seltzer to meet a gentleman so recently from his old home, New York. On this account he made the stranger doubly welcome. Mr. Burton was interested in his host and liked him, perceiving him to be intelligent, generous, and enthusiastic. His heart rebuked him when he thought of the mission upon which he had come into this little retired paradise, so remote from the world and so lovely in itself that it did seem as if evil ought to have forgotten it. The two had conversed nearly an hour when Don Miguel said, "It is now our supper hour. Allow a servant to show you to your apartment, where we will give you time to at least bathe your face and hands after your weary ride. I was so entertained with the news that you bring me from the States that I have neglected your comfort. Dr. Seltzer went up on the mountain today to look after our mining interest a little, but I expect his return every moment. He will be charmed to meet a countryman." This last assertion Mr. Burton doubted, for he knew that the remorse of a guilty conscience stung the possessor into a restlessness which made any unexpected event a matter of suspicion. As the door closed upon him in the large, airy chamber into which he was ushered, he sunk for a few minutes into a chair, and something like a tremor shook his usually steady nerves. He stood so close upon the probable accomplishment of the object he had kept in view for 2 years that, for an instant, excitement overcame him. He soon rallied, however, and at the end of 15 minutes, when the peon came in again to announce dinner, he had toned up his courage with a plentiful dash of cold water, and was never more his own peculiar self than when he set foot in the supper-room. A glance told him that the absent member of the family had not yet returned. Only 2 persons were present, his host, and the beautiful woman whom he introduced as his daughter, Mrs. Seltzer. The 3 sat down to the table, which was covered with an elegant repast, the first dish of which was a fine-flavored roast wild turkey. There was a plentiful supply of porcelain and silverware. It did not take 5 seconds for the guest to decide that the quondam druggist of Blankville, if this were indeed the person as he assumed with such certainty, had gotten himself into enviable quarters. As his penetrating glance rested on the exquisite face which confronted him across the pale spectre of the salt, he kept asking himself, with inward anguish, why it was that he had not circumvented this adventurer sooner, before the young, girlish creature he saw before him had involved her fate with that of the guilty. Beautiful as our dreamiest fancies of Spanish women she was, according to the report of Mr. Burton, and he was no enthusiast. He saw that she was as uneasy as a bird which misses its mate, her black eyes constantly wandering to the door, and her ear so preoccupied with listening for the expected step as scarcely to take note of the remarks made to her by the stranger. Once she asked him, with much interest, if he had known Dr. Seltzer in New York, but upon his answering in the negative, he could guess that he had fallen in her esteem, for she immediately withdrew her attention from him. The senses of the guest were all keenly on the alert, but it was by the sudden fire which leaped and melted in the eyes of the donna, and the rich color which shot into her hitherto olive cheek, that he was informed of the approach of her husband. She had heard the rapid gallop of his horse afar off, and now sat, mute and expectant, until he should arrive at the gate, cross the veranda, and enter the room. In 3 minutes he stood in the supper-room. The visitor met him just in the manner he would have most desired, when the man was entirely unwarned of company, and had no chance to put on a mask. Outwardly Mr. Burton was serene as a summer day, but inwardly his teeth were set upon each other to keep his tongue from crying out, "This is the man!" When Dr. Seltzer first perceived a stranger in the room, and heard his father-in-law say, "A countryman of yours from New York, doctor," his slight start of surprise would, to most persons, have appeared no more than natural, but the person whose courteous eye met his saw in it the first impulse of an ever-ready apprehension and alarm, covered instantly by a false warmth of manner which caused him to greet the stranger with extreme friendliness. The newcomer retired for a moment to his room to prepare for the meal. Upon his taking his place at table, hot dishes were brought in. The donna seemed also to have recovered her appetite, which had been spoiled by his absence. A gay and social hour followed. Dr. Seltzer might have been good-looking had his eyes not possessed the shifting, uncertain glance that plays before a soul which dares not frankly meet its fellows, and had not an evil expression predominated on his features. His face was one which would have been distrusted in any intelligent company of our own people, but the Spaniards, with whom he was now associated, were so accustomed to treachery and untruth among their race, and so familiar with kindred features and subtle black eyes, that he, doubtless, had never impressed them unfavorably. A Spaniard he was at heart, and he had found, in his present life, a congenial sphere. Not that all Spaniards are necessarily murderers, but their code of right and wrong is different from ours. Don Miguel was an excellent gentleman, honorable to an unusual degree for a Mexican, real and sanguine in his feelings, and thoroughly deceived as to the character and acquirements of the person to whom he had confided so much. It was the bitter flavor in the cup of his assured triumph that Mr. Burton, in bringing the villain to bay, must shock this amiable host and ruin the happiness of his innocent child. After supper, they sat on the veranda a couple of hours. The half-filled moon sunk down behind the groves of fragrant trees. The stars burned in the sky, large, and, to a northern eye, preternaturally bright. The wind was luscious with warmth and sweetness, and the beautiful woman, whose soft eyes dwelt ever on the face of her husband, looked yet more lovely in the clear moonlight. Through all the earnestness of his story, my friend dwelt on these details, because he observed them at the time, and they became a part of the narrative in his mind. The conversation was principally upon mining. Mr. Burton had sufficient scientific knowledge to make it apparent that his exploring expedition was for the purpose of adding to that knowledge. Before they separated for the night, Dr. Seltzer had promised to escort him, on the following day, over all the mountainous portion of the ranch. The visitor retired early, being fatigued with his journey, but he did not sleep as quietly as usual. He was disturbed by the onerous duty to which he had devoted himself, visions of the donna, pale with grief and reproach, and of the interview which he had resolved upon the murderer, alone on the mountainside, when, by the force of will and the suddenness of the accusation, he expected to wring from him the desired confession, kept him long awake. Once he half rose in his bed, for lying in that feverish condition when all the senses are exalted, he heard, or fancied he heard, the handle of the door turned, and a person stepped silently into the apartment. Knowing the thievish propensities of the Spanish servants, he had no doubt but one of these had entered for purposes of robbery. He therefore remained quiet, but ready to pounce upon the intruder should he detect him approaching the bed. The room was entirely dark, the moon having set some time before. Whether he made some sound when rising on his couch, or whether the visitor gave up his purpose at the last moment, he could only conjecture. After some moments of absolute silence, he heard the door drawn slowly together again, and was conscious of being alone. Soon after this he dropped asleep, and awoke in the dawn to find his purse and garments undisturbed. He was summoned to an early breakfast, which was partaken of by the two excursionists alone. His companion was, if possible, more social and friendly than on the previous evening. It was yet hardly sunrise when they arose from the table to mount the horses which awaited them at the door. A basket of lunch was attached to the pommel of Dr. Seltzer's saddle, whose parting injunction to the servant was to have dinner at 4, as they should stand in need of it upon their return. Then, through a world of dew, coolness, and perfume, glittering with the first rays of the sun, the two men rode off toward the mountains. After following a good road some 5 or 6 miles, they commenced climbing the first of the series of hills of which mention has been made. The road here was still tolerable, but when they advanced into the immediate region of the mines, they were compelled to abandon their horses, which were left at a small building belonging to the ranch, and to proceed on foot into the mountain gorges. The scenery now became wild beyond mere picturesqueness. It was startling, desolate, grand. Traces of old mines, once worked, but now deserted, were everywhere visible. Finally they came to a new lead, which was being successfully worked by the peons of Don Miguel. There were some 40 of these men at work, under an overseer. Dr. Seltzer showed his companion the recent improvements which had been made, the machinery which he himself had introduced, and a portion of which he had invented, stating that, under the system which he himself had introduced, Don Miguel was growing a rich man faster than he previously had any idea was possible. The mountain stream, spoken of as being visible at a great distance, glittering from height to height, was here made to do the unromantic work of washing the ore and grinding it. The overseer was called upon by the host to give every desirable information to the traveler, and here a long visit was made. Lunch was partaken of under the cool shadow of a ledge of rock, and then Dr. Seltzer proposed, if his visitor was not already too much fatigued, to take him higher up, to a spot which he had discovered only the day before, and which he had every reason to believe contained a richer deposit of silver than any vein heretofore opened. In fact, he thought a fortune lay hidden in the wild gorge to which he referred, and he anxiously invited the scientific observation of his guest. This was just the opportunity for being alone with his man that Mr. Burton desired. It may seem strange that he proposed to confront the murderer with his guilt in this solitary manner, with no witnesses to corroborate any testimony he might wring from the guilty, but the detective knew enough of human nature to know that the confronted criminal is almost always a coward, and he had no fear that this person, if guilty, accused of his false name and falser character, would refuse to do what he demanded of him. Again, his principal object, more important by far than the discovery of the actual hired assassin, was to gain from the frightened accomplice a full, explicit confession of who had tempted him to the crime, who was really the most guilty murderer, whose money had paid for the deed, which his own dastardly hand had shrunk from. Strong in resources, which never yet had failed him, Mr. Burton was anxious for the singular encounter he had devised. Leaving all traces of man behind them, the two climbed a rugged path and entered a cañon, through the center of which roared a foaming torrent, and which was so deep and sheltered that even at this noon hour the path was cool and the sunlight tempered. As they walked or clambered on, both men gradually grew silent. Of what Dr. Seltzer might be thinking, Mr. Burton did not know. His own mind was absorbed in the scene which he was awaiting the earliest fitting moment to enact. The doctor, who should have acted as guide, had somehow chanced to lag behind. "Which direction shall I take?" asked Mr. Burton presently. "Ascend the narrow defile to the right," called out his companion, pressing after him. "But be cautious of your footing. A misstep may hurl you upon the rocks below. In 3 minutes we shall be in a safe and beautiful region, with our feet literally treading a silver floor." As he spoke thus, he drew nearer, but the path was too narrow to allow him to take the advance, and Mr. Burton continued to lead the way. The subtle perceptions of the detective, a magnetism which amounted almost to the marvelous, I have so frequently referred to, that my reader will understand how it was that Mr. Burton, thus in the van, and not looking at his companion, felt a curious, prickly sensation run along his nerves. He came to the narrowest part of the dangerous path. An immense rock reached up, a mighty wall upon the right, and to the left, far below the uneven, stony, and briar-grown ledge along which he was picking his steps, foamed and roared the torrent, over rocks which thrust themselves here and there above the yeasty water. Directly in front arose an obstacle in the shape of a projection of the rock some 3 or 4 feet in height, covered with tough little bushes, one of which he took hold of to draw himself up by. However, instead of pulling himself up, as his action seemed to indicate that he was about to do, he turned and grasped the arm of Dr. Seltzer. His movement was rapid as lightning, but it was not made a moment too soon. The arm which he held in a clasp of steel was raised to strike, and a Spanish dirk was in the hand. A stealthy, murderous light, almost red in its intensity, burned in the eyes which now sunk before his. An instant the foiled assassin stood surprised. Then commenced a struggle between the two men. Dr. Seltzer made desperate efforts to hurl his antagonist into the torrent beneath, but though frantic with rage and hate, his violent exertions did not effect their object. On the contrary, Mr. Burton, calm and self-possessed, despite an instant's astonishment, pressed his adversary backward along the narrow path until they were both on safe ground, in the middle of a little grassy plateau, which they had lately traversed, where he held him, having disarmed him of his knife. What had caused his momentary astonishment was the fact that Dr. Seltzer knew him and suspected his object, which truth he instantly comprehended upon turning and reading the murderous eyes that met his. Now, as he held him, he remarked, "Another stab in the back, George Thorley? Well, and what did you come here for, you accursed New York detective?" "I came to persuade you to turn state's evidence." "What about?" There was a slight change in the voice, which told against his will that the adventurer felt relieved. "I want you to give your written and sworn testimony as to who it was hired you, for the sum of $2,000, to murder Mr. Moreland at Blankville on the 17th of October, 1857. "Who said I murdered him? Humph! You must think I'm decidedly simple to be coaxed or frightened into committing myself." "We'll not waste words, Thorley. I know you, all your history, all your bad deeds, or enough of them to hang you. I have a warrant for your arrest in my pocket, which I brought from the United States with me. I could have brought an escort from Acapulco and arrested you at once, without giving you any chance for explanation. But I have my own reasons for desiring to keep this matter quiet, one of which is that I do not wish any premature report to alarm your accomplice, man or woman, whichever it is, until I can put my hand on the right person." "What makes you think that I did it?" "No matter what makes me think so. I don't think, I know. I have the instrument with which you committed the act, with your initials on the handle. I have the letter you wrote to your accomplice, claiming your reward. In short, I've proof enough to convict you twice over. The only hope you have of any mercy from me is in at once doing all that I ask of you, which is to give a full written statement, over your real name, of all the circumstances which led to the murder." "I'm not such a fool as to tie the rope around my own neck." As he made this answer, he gave a powerful jerk to extricate himself from the unpleasant position in which he was held. Mr. Burton drew a revolver from his breast pocket, remarking, "I will not hold you, Thorley, but just as sure as you make an attempt to get away, I will shoot you. Supposing you succeeded in getting free from me, what good would that do you? Your prospects here would be ruined, for I should expose you to Don Miguel. You would have to flee from wife, country, and fortune. All you would preserve would be your rascally life, which I do not propose, at present, to take. A man's life is his best possession, a truth you would have done well to remember before you took away the life of another. I can't talk to such a scoundrel as you, Thorley. I fairly ache to inflict upon you the punishment you deserve. It is for the sake of others in whom I am interested that I give you this one chance of mercy. Here is paper, pen, and ink. Sit down on that stone there and write what I asked of you. What security do you offer me against the consequences of criminating myself? I want you to promise I shall be none the worse off for it." "You are too fully in my power to demand promises of me. Yet this I will consent to, as I said before, for the sake of others, to let you go unimprisoned by the warrant I hold against you, and never to put the officers of justice on your track. One thing, however, I must and shall do. I cannot leave this paradise into which you have crept like the serpent, without warning Don Miguel what manner of creature he is trusting and sheltering." "Oh, don't do that, Mr. Burton. He'll turn me off on the world again, and I shall be exposed to the same temptations as ever. And here I was leading a better life. I was, indeed, reformed, quite reformed and repentant." "So reformed and repentant, so very excellent, that you were only prevented but now from killing me and tumbling me into this convenient ravine by my own prudence. Everything was at stake, you know. I was desperate. You must forgive me. It would not be natural for me to submit to see all I had gained snatched away from me, my life periled. I recognized you within 5 minutes after sitting down to the supper table last night." "I had no idea you had ever seen me," said Mr. Burton, willing to hear how it was that this man knew him, when he had never met Thorley until yesterday. "I was interested once in a forgery case in which you were employed to detect the criminals, by the examination of several handwritings which were given you. You accused a highly respectable fellow citizen, to the astonishment of everybody, and convicted him, too. I, whom he had employed as an agent in some transactions, but who did not appear in any manner in the case, saw you in the courtroom once or twice. I accidentally found out that you were a secret agent of the detective police. When I saw you here, playing the scientific gentleman, my conscience was not so easy as to blind me. I saw the game and what was at stake. I had the choice between my own safety or yours. I wasn't so self-denying as to decide in your favor, and so—" "You visited my room last night." "Yes, but on second thought I decided that today would give me the better opportunity. Had you waited a second longer, your friends would have had a hard time tracing your fate. An excuse to my father-in-law that you had returned to Acapulco without stopping, by a nearer route, would have ended inquiry here. He set his teeth as he concluded, unable to conceal how much he regretted that this convenient denouement had been interrupted. Was it chance caused you to turn? He continued, after a moment's silence. It was watchfulness. I thought I saw murder in your eyes once before, today when I met them suddenly. But as I believed myself unknown to you, I could hardly credit my own impression. It grew upon me, however, as we proceeded, and, by the pricking of my ribs, I turned in time to prevent the compliment you were about to pay me. But this is wasting time. Write what I expect of you. I shall permit no lies. I can tell when I see one or hear one. If you say anything which is not true, I shall make you correct it. Coerced by the eye which never ceased to watch his slightest movement, and by the revolver held in range of his breast, the reluctant doctor took the sheet of paper and the fountain pen which were offered him, sat down on the stone, and, with the top of his sombrero for a desk, wrote slowly for 10 or 15 minutes. Then he arose and handed the document, which was signed with his real name, to the detective, who, with one eye on his prisoner and one on the paper, continued to read the evidence without giving his companion a chance to profit by any relaxation of his vigilance. "You have told the truth, for once in your life," was his remark, as he finished reading the paper. "I had found this out myself, fact for fact, all but 1 or 2 facts which you give here, but I preferred having your testimony before I brought the matter before the proper parties. Therefore, I came here after it," speaking as if a trip to Acapulco were one of the easiest and most commonplace of things. "You're damned cool about it," remarked the adventurer, eyeing his adversary with a glance of hate, with which was mingled a forced admiration of a sharpness which, had he himself possessed it, he could have used to such advantage. "And now, maybe you'll be good enough to tell me if the affair kicked up much of a row." "I cannot talk with you. I want you to lead the way back to our horses, for since my business with you is finished, I may say that I do not fancy your company. You must go with me before Don Miguel, and we will enlighten him as to your true character, since with him, to be forewarned may be forearmed." "Oh, don't do that. I beg you to spare me for my wife's sake. It would kill her. She loves me so much." And the creature dropped on his knees. "I would, indeed, rather than blast her innocent heart with such knowledge, allow you still to play your part in that little family. But I know that, sooner or later, you will contrive to break the heart of that confiding woman, and it may be worse in the future than even now. She has yet no children. She is young, and the wound may heal. It is an unpleasant duty which I must perform." Then followed a scene of begging, prayers, even tears upon one side, and relentless purpose on the other. End of Part 2, Chapter 6. Part 2, Chapter 7 of The Dead Letter by Metta Victoria Fuller Victor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Now for home again. Dr. Seltzer and his scientific friend returned down the mountain, reaching the flowery carriageway which led up to the mansion about 4 p.m. But here the former suddenly whirled his horse and set off toward Acapulco at his utmost speed. Mr. Burton did not fire at him to stop him. If he wished to run away from the horrible exposure which he had not the courage to face, it was no longer any business of the detective. This very flight would prove his guilt the more incontestably. It was with a pang of pity that he noticed the Donna coming forth on the piazza with a face illumined with expectation of meeting her husband. He replied to her inquiry that the doctor had gone down the road without saying how long he expected to be gone, and asking a private interview with Don Miguel, he at once, without circumlocution, laid before him the painful facts. Of course the Don was shocked and grieved beyond expression, more on his daughter's account than on his own, and blamed himself severely for having introduced a stranger without proper credentials into his confidence. If the murder had been committed from jealousy, anger, or upon any impulse of passion, he would not have thought so badly of the young man, but that it should have been done for money was to him an irreparable crime and disgrace. Mr. Burton had thought of returning to Acapulco that afternoon and evening, considering that his presence could not be welcome to the family under such circumstances. But Don Miguel positively forbade him to attempt the journey at that late hour, as it might be dangerous at any time, and now, if the doctor wished to revenge himself upon his betrayer, a better opportunity could not occur than on this lonely road, where he might linger in the expectation of his passing. From the interview which followed between the father and his child, Mr. Burton was absent. He saw no more of the beautiful young wife, for he left the hacienda early the following morning, but her father informed him that she bore the news better than he expected, simply because she refused to believe in the guilt of her husband. Don Miguel and his 2 servants accompanied Mr. Burton all the way back to town, the Don affirming that he had some business requiring a visit to the city sooner or later, though his guest knew very well that his real object was to protect him from any danger which might threaten. For this he was grateful, though his courage did not shrink even from the idea of secret assassination. He was detained in Acapulco several days before he had an opportunity of leaving for the Isthmus. During that time he learned, by a messenger whom Don Miguel sent him, that during the Don's absence from the house in the 2 days of his journey to town and back, Dr. Seltzer had returned there, possessed himself of every article of value which he could carry away upon his person, including the Dona's jewels, which she had inherited from her mother, and a large sum in gold, and had persuaded his wife to accompany his flying fortunes to some unknown region. In the letter which Don Miguel wrote to the stranger, he expressed himself as one robbed and left desolate. It was not the loss of money or jewels, but the loss of his poor, confiding, loving child that he dwelt upon. The Donaz was one of those impulsive, impassioned natures which must love, even if it knows the object unworthy. No deed which her husband could commit could make him otherwise to her than the man with whose fate her own was linked for better or worse. Mr. Burton folded up the letter with a sigh. No power of his could amend the fate of this young creature, which promised to be so sad. While he remained in the ruinous old place, he used extraordinary precautions to ensure his own safety, for he believed that Dr. Seltzer or George Thorley would seek revenge upon him, not only for the sake of the revenge, but to silence the accusation which he might carry back to the States. It was well that he was thus careful, as among other proofs that he was thus pursued was the following. One afternoon, as he sat in the great breezy corridor of the hotel, an old woman came in with a basket and offered to sell him some particularly fine oranges. He bought a couple of the largest and was about to eat one when he observed that she did not offer the fruit to any other customer. Upon this he regarded her more closely and was satisfied that all was not right. When she had lingered a time to notice if he ate the fruit, he strolled out to the street, and in her presence called up a stray pig, to which he fed pieces of the orange. When she saw this, the old hag, who was an Indian, quickly disappeared, and shortly after the pig died. It was therefore with feelings of satisfaction that the detective finally bade farewell to Acapulco on a return steamer. He had waited some time at the Isthmus, where the days had hung heavily, but he had comforted himself with his motto about patience, and now, as he assured me at the close of his narrative, if heaven would give us a propitious passage home, we should be in time. All would be right. Day was breaking when Mr. Burton finished his narrative. The rain had ceased, but a thick fog hung over the sea and land, making everything gloomy and disagreeable. I must go now and awaken my little girl, he said, rising. But you have not read me the written confession of that Thorley. Richard, you must forgive me if I do not see fit to allow you to read it at present. I have a purpose in it, or I should not keep back from you any of my own information. That confession did not surprise me. I knew the murderer long ago, but I could not prove it. You shall soon be at rest about this affair. I only pray now for a speedy voyage, and that Leesy Sullivan may be alive when we reach New York. Richard, he added with a passionate gesture, you do not dream what a constant fever I am in. I am so afraid we shall be too late. I cannot bear the horror which that would be to me. And indeed it did seem at that time as if my own engrossing interest was scarcely equal to that of my companion, who yet had nothing at all at stake, while I had so much. Not only then, but at various other times during the remainder of our voyage, he expressed so much anxiety lest Miss Sullivan should be dead before we arrived home, that I, who was always torturing myself with conjectures, again revived my suspicions that she was connected with the murder. In the meantime, the sun arose upon the bustle of disembarking from the steamer to the cars. Fortunately, the fog lifted by 8 o'clock, and we could enjoy the magnificent scenery through which the cars whirled us, scenery so at variance in its wildness and the exuberance of its foliage, and the secluded aspect of its beauty, with this noisy wonder of civilization which scattered its fiery deluge of sparks along the path of gorgeous tropical flowers waving at us, sometimes in long streamers of bloom from the topmost branches of gigantic trees. Nothing occurred to mar the tranquillity of the passage home. On the expected day, we landed at the dock in New York, and I stepped upon the earth with a curious, excited feeling, now that we drew so near to the close of our efforts, which made me almost lightheaded. We took a carriage and drove to Mr. Burton's. He was expected by the housekeeper, so that we found the house prepared for our reception. A fine dinner was served at the usual hour, but I could not eat. Appetite and sleep fled before my absorbing anticipations. My host, who noticed my intense, repressed excitement, promised me, before I retired for the night, that tomorrow, God willing, the secret places of the wicked should be laid bare, that myself and all those interested should witness the triumph of the innocent and the confusion of the guilty. End of Part 2, Chapter 7. Part 2, Chapter 8 of The Dead Letter by Metta Victoria Fuller Victor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ripe Hour. I arose from my sleepless bed to face this, the most memorable day of my life. Whether I ate or drank, I know not, but I noticed that Mr. Burton's countenance wore a peculiar, illuminated look, as if his soul was inwardly rejoicing over a victory gained. However, there was still some preoccupation in it, and some perplexity. Immediately after breakfast, he proposed to go out, saying, "Richard, remain here a few hours with Lenore until I find out whether Miss Sullivan is dead or alive. I should not have gone to bed last night without knowing, had I not been troubled with a severe headache. This is now the first step in the day's duties. As soon as possible, I will report progress." And he went out. The time of his absence seemed very long. Lenore, sweet child, with much of her father's perception, saw that I was restless and impatient, and made many pretty efforts to entertain me. She sung me some of the finest music, while I roamed about the parlors like an ill-bred tiger. At the end of 2 hours my friend returned, looking less perplexed than when he went out. "God is good," he said, shaking my hand as if thus congratulating me. "Leesy Sullivan is alive, but very feeble. She is scarcely able to undertake a journey, but, since I have explained the object, she has consented to go. She says she is so near death's door that it matters not how soon she passes through, and she is willing, for the sake of others, to endure a trial from which she might naturally shrink. So far, then, all is well." Was this trial of which he spoke that pang which she must feel in confessing herself implicated in this matter? Did he think, and had he persuaded her, since she was too far gone for the grasp of the law to take hold of her, she might now confess a dangerous and dark secret? I could not answer the questions my mind persisted in asking. "It will be but a few hours," I whispered to myself. "We are to go up to Blankville by the evening train," he continued. "Leesy will accompany us. Until that time, there is nothing to do." I would rather have worked at breaking stones or lifting barrels than to have kept idle, but as the detective wished me to remain in the house as a matter of caution against meeting any prying acquaintance upon the streets, I was forced to that dreariest of all things, to wait. The hours did finally pass, and Mr. Burton set out first with the carriage to convey Miss Sullivan to the depot, where I was to meet him in time for the 5 o'clock train. When I saw her there, I wondered how she had strength to endure the ride. She looked so wasted, such a mere flickering spark of life, which a breath might extinguish. Mr. Burton had almost to carry her into the car, where he placed her on a seat with his overcoat for a pillow. We took our seats opposite to her, and as those large, unfathomable eyes met mine, still blazing with their old luster beneath the pallid brow, I cannot describe the sensations which rushed over me. All those strange scenes through which I had passed at Moreland Villa floated up and shut me in a strange spell, until I forgot what place we were in, or that any other person surrounded us. When the cars moved rapidly out of the city, increasing their speed as they got beyond the precincts, Leesy asked to have the window open. The air was cold and fresh, her feverish lips swallowed it as a reviving draught. I gazed alternately at her and the landscape, already flushed with the red of early sunset. It was a December day, chill but bright. The ground was frozen, and the river sparkled with the keen blueness of splintered steel. The red banner of twilight hung over the Palisades. I lived really 3 years in that short ride. The 3 years just passed, and when we reached our destination, I walked like one in a dream. It was quite evening when we got out at Blankville, though the moon was shining. A fussy little woman passed out before us, lugging a large bandbox. She handed it to the town express, telling the driver to be very careful of it, and take it round at once to Esquire Argyll's. "I suppose it contains the wedding bonnet," he said with a laugh. "That it does, and the dress too, all of my own selection," said the little woman, with an air of importance. "Just you carry it in your hand, sir, and don't you allow nothing to come near it." When I heard these words, a hot flush came to my face. That Mary Argyll was already married, or expected to be very soon, I knew. But I could not hear this reference to the wedding, nor see this article of preparation, without keen pain. Yet, what business was it of mine? Mr. Burton had also heard the brief colloquy, and I noticed his lips pressed together with a fierce expression as we passed under the lamp which lighted the crossing. He took us into the hotel by the depot. Oh, how suffocating, how close became memory! Into this building poor Henry had been carried on that wretched morning. It seemed to be but yesterday. I think Leesy was recalling it all, for when a cup of tea was brought in for her at Mr. Burton's bidding, she turned from it with loathing. "Leesy," he said, looking at her firmly, and speaking in a tone of high command, "I don't want you to fail me now. The trial will soon be over. Brace yourself for it with all the strength you have. Now, I am going out for a few moments, perhaps for half an hour. When I return, you will both be ready to go with me to Mr. Argyll's house." I was nearly as much shaken by this prospect as the frail woman who sat trembling in a corner of the sofa. To go into that house, from which I had departed with such ignominy, to see Eleanor face to face, to meet them all who had once been my friends, to greet them as strangers, for such they must be, to me, to appear in their midst under such strange circumstances, to hear, I knew not what, to learn that mystery, my heart grew as if walled in with ice. It could not half beat, and felt cold in my breast. Both Leesy and myself started when Mr. Burton again appeared in the room. "All is right thus far," he said in a clear, cheery voice, which nevertheless had the high ring of excitement. "Come now, let us not waste the golden moments, for now the hour is ripe." We had each of us to give an arm to Miss Sullivan, who could scarcely put one foot before the other. We walked slowly along over that path which I never had trodden since the night of the murder without a shudder. A low moan came from Leesy's lips as we passed the spot where the body of Henry Moreland had been discovered. Presently we came to the gate of the Argyll place, and here Mr. Burton again left us. "Follow me," he said, "in 5 minutes. Come to the library door and knock, and, Richard, I particularly desire you to take a seat by the bay window." He went up the walk and entered the house, without seeming to ring the hall bell, leaving the door open as he passed in. I looked at my watch by the moonlight, forcing myself to count the minutes, by way of steadying my head, which was all in a whirl. When the time expired, I helped Leesy forward into the dim hall, on to the library door, where I knocked according to directions, and was admitted by Mr. Argyll himself. There was a bright light shining from the chandelier, fully illuminating the room. In the midst of a flood of recollections, I stepped within, but my brain, which had been hot and dizzy before, grew suddenly calm and cool. When Mr. Argyll saw that it was me, he slightly recoiled, and gave me no greeting whatever. A glance assured me that every member of the family was present. Eleanor sat in an armchair near the center table. Mary and James occupied the same sofa. Eleanor looked at me with a kind of white amazement. James nodded as my eye met his face expressing surprise and displeasure. Mary rose, hesitated, and finally came forward, saying, "How do you do, Richard?" I bowed to her, but did not take her outstretched hand, and she returned to her place near James. In the meantime, Mr. Burton himself placed Leesy Sullivan in an easy-chair. I walked forward and took a seat near the window. I had time to observe the appearance of my whilom friends, and was calm enough to do it. Mr. Argyll had grown old much faster than the time warranted. His form was somewhat bent, and his whole appearance feeble. I grieved, as I noticed this, as though he was my own father, for I once had loved him as much. Mary looked the same as when I had seen her 3 months since, in that surreptitious visit to the oak, blooming and beautiful, the image of what Eleanor once was. Eleanor, doubtless, was whiter than her wont, for my appearance had startled her, but there was the same rapt, far-away, spiritual look upon her features, which they had worn since that day when she had wedded herself to the spirit of her lover. Mr. Burton turned the key in the lock of the door which opened into the hall. then crossed over and closed the parlor door and sat down by it, saying as he did so, "Mr. Argyll, I told you a few minutes ago that I had news of importance to communicate, and I take the liberty of closing these doors, for it would be very unpleasant for us to be intruded upon, or for any of the servants to hear anything of what I have to say. You will perhaps guess the nature of my communication from my having brought with me these two persons. I would not agitate any of you by the introduction of the painful subject, if I did not believe that you would rather know the truth, even if it is sad to revive the past. But I must beg of you to be calm and to listen quietly to what I have to say." "I will be very calm, do not be afraid," murmured Eleanor, growing yet feebler, for it was to her he now particularly addressed the injunction. I was so occupied with her that I did not notice the effect upon the others. "Mr. Argyll," continued the detective, "I have never yet abandoned a case of this kind until I have unraveled its mystery to the last thread. Nearly 2 years have passed since you supposed that I ceased to exert myself to discover the murderer of Henry Moreland, but I have never, for a day, allowed the case to lie idle in my mind. Whenever I have had leisure, I have partially followed every clue which was put in my hands at the time when we first had the matter under discussion. It was not alone the sad circumstances of the tragedy which gave it an unusual interest to me. I became warmly attached to your family, and, as from the first, yes, from the very first hour when I heard of the murder, I believed I had discovered the perpetrator. I could not allow the matter to sink into silence. You remember, of course, our last interview. Some ideas were there presented which I then opposed. You know how the discussion of all the facts then known ended. Your suspicions fell upon one who had been an honored and favored member of your family. You feared, although you were not certain, that Richard Redfield committed the deed. You gave me all the reasons you had for your opinions. Good reasons, too, some of them were, but I then combated the idea. However, I was more or less affected by what you said, and I told you before parting that, if you had such feelings toward the young man, you ought not to allow him to be, any longer, a member of your family. I believe he came to understand the light in which you regarded him, and shortly after left the place, and since has been most of the time in Washington, employed there as a clerk in the dead letter office. I believe now, Mr. Argyll, that you were not far wrong in your conjectures. I have discovered the murderer of Henry Moreland, and can give you positive proof of it." This assertion, deliberately uttered, caused the sensation which might be expected. Eleanor, with all her long habit of self-control, gave a slight shriek, and began to tremble like a leaf. Exclamations came from the lips of all. I believe James uttered an oath, but I am not certain, for I, perhaps more than any other in the room, was at that moment confounded. As the idea rushed over me that Mr. Burton had been acting a part toward me, and had taken these precautions to get me utterly in his power, where I could not defend myself, I started to my feet. "Sit still, Mr. Redfield," said the detective to me sternly. "There is no avenue of escape for the guilty." And rising, he took the key of the door and put it in his pocket, giving me a look difficult to understand. I did sit down again, not so much because he told me, as that I was powerless from amazement. As I did so, I met the eyes of James, which laughed silently with a triumph so hateful that, at the moment, they seemed to me the eyes of a devil. All the feelings which, at various times, had been called up by this terrible affair were nothing to those which overwhelmed me during the few moments which followed. My thought tracked many avenues with lightning rapidity, but I could find no light at the end of any of them. I began to believe that George Thorley, in his confession, had criminated me, who knew him not, who never had spoken with him, and that this was the reason why Mr. Burton had withheld that document from me, falsely professing friendship while leading me into the pit. If so, what secret enemy had I who could instruct him to lay the murder at my door? If he had accused me, I was well aware that many little circumstances might be turned so as to strengthen the accusation. I sat there dumb, but there is always strength in innocence, even when betrayed by its friends, so I remained quiet and listened. "When a crime like this is committed," proceeded the detective, quite calm in the midst of our excitement, "we usually look for the motive. Next to avarice, come the passions of revenge and jealousy in frequency. We know that money had nothing to do with Henry Moreland's death. Revenge and jealousy had. There lived in Blankville 3 or 4 years ago a young fellow, a druggist, by the name of George Thorley. You remember him, Mr. Argyll?" Mr. Argyll nodded his head. He was an adventurer, self-instructed in medicine, without principle. Shortly after setting up in your village, he fell in love with this woman here, Miss Sullivan. She rejected him, both because she had a dim perception of his true character, and because she was interested in another. She allows me to say here what she once before confessed to us, that she loved Henry Moreland, loved him purely and unselfishly, with no wish but for his happiness, and no hope of ever being anything more to him than his mother's sewing girl, to whom he extended some acts of kindness. But George Thorley, with the sharpness of jealousy, discovered her passion, which she supposed was hidden from mortal eyes, and conceived the brutal hate of a low nature against the young gentleman, who was ignorant alike of him and his sentiments. So far, no harm was done, and evil might never have come of it, for Henry Moreland moved in a sphere different from his, and they might never have come in contact. But another bosom was also possessed of the fiend of jealousy. An inmate of your family had learned to love your daughter Eleanor, not only to love her, but to look forward to the fortune and position which would be conferred by a marriage with her as something extremely desirable. He would not reconcile himself to the engagement which was formed between Miss Argyle and Mr. Moreland. He cherished bad thoughts, which became more bitter as their happiness became more apparent. Once he was standing at the gate of this lawn, when the young couple passed him, going out for a walk together. He looked after them with a dark look, speaking aloud, unconsciously, the thought of his heart. He said, "I hate him. I wish he were dead." Instantly, to his surprise and dismay, a voice replied, "I'm with you there. You don't wish it so much as I do." The speaker was Thorley, who, passing, had been arrested by the young couple going out of the gate, and who had remained also gazing after them. It was an unfortunate coincidence. The first speaker looked at the second with anger and chagrin, but he had betrayed himself, and the other knew it. He laughed impudently as he sauntered on, but presently he returned and whispered, "I wouldn't object to putting him out of the way if I was well paid for it." "What do you mean?" inquired the other angrily, and the response was, "Just what I say. I hate him as bad as you do. You've got money, or can get it, and I can't. Pay me well for the job, and I'll put him out of your way so securely that he won't interfere with your plans any more." The young gentleman affected to be, and perhaps was, indignant. The fellow went off, smirking, but his words left, as he thought they would, their poison behind. In less than a month from that time, the person sought Thorley out in his lurking place in the city, for he had, you recollect, been driven from Blankville by the voice of public opinion, and had conferred with him upon the possibility of young Moreland being put out of the way, without risk of discovery of those who had a hand in it. Thorley agreed to manage everything without risk to anyone. He wanted $3,000, but his accomplice, who was aware that you were about to draw $2,000 from a bank in New York, promised him that sum, with which he agreed to be satisfied. It was expected and planned that the murder should be committed in the city, but as the time drew nigh for accomplishing it, opportunity did not present. Finally, as the steamer upon which Thorley wished to flee to California was about to sail, and no better thing offered, he concluded to follow Mr. Moreland out in the evening train and stab him, under cover of the rain and darkness, somewhere between the depot and the house. This he did. Then, afraid to take the cars for fear of being suspected, he went down along the docks, took possession of a small boat which lay moored by a chain, broke the chain, and rowed down the river, completely protected by the storm from human observation. The next morning found him in New York, dress, complexion, and hair changed, with nothing about him to excite the least suspicion that he was connected with the tragedy that was just becoming known. However, he wrote a letter directed to John Owen Peekskill, in which he stated in obscure terms that the instrument with which the murder was committed would be found secreted in a certain oak tree on these premises, and that it had better be taken care of. I have the letter and the broken instrument. The way it came to be concealed in the tree was this. After the murder, being so well sheltered by the storm, he was bold enough to approach the house, in hopes of communicating with his accomplice, and receiving the money directly from his hands, which would prevent the latter from the necessity of making a trip to Brooklyn to pay it. He saw nothing of him, however, perceiving that he could look into the parlor through the open half of the shutter by climbing the large oak at the corner. He did so, and was looking at you all for some minutes on that evening. Perceiving by the light which shone from the window that the instrument was broken at the point, he at once comprehended how important it was to get rid of it, and chancing to discover a hollow spot in the limb he stood on, he worked it well into the rotten heart of the wood. He it was whom Miss Sullivan detected descending from the tree on that awful night, when she, alas, led by a hopeless though a pure love, passing the house on her way to her aunt's, could not deny herself a stolen look at the happiness of the two beings, so soon, she thought, to be made one. She never expected to see them again until after their marriage, and a wild, foolish impulse, if I must call it so, urged her into the garden to look through the open bay window, a folly which came near having serious consequences for her. George Thorley escaped, and fulfilled the program so far as to sail for San Francisco. But the boat stopping at Acapulco, he received an offer there, from a Spanish gentleman, of a position of doctor on his immense estates. It was just the country for a character like that of Thorley to prosper in. He accepted the proposition, wormed himself into the esteem of the Spaniard, married his daughter, and was flourishing to his heart's content, when I came suddenly upon him and disturbed his serenity. Yes, Mr. Argyll, I started for California after the villain, for I had traces of him which led me to take the journey, and it was by a providential accident that I ascertained he was near Acapulco, where I also landed, sought him out, and wrung a confession from him, which I have here in writing. He has told the story plainly, and I have every other evidence to confirm it which a court of law could possibly require. I could hang his accomplice, without doubt. At the first mention of the name of George Thorley, I chanced to be looking at James, over whose countenance passed an indescribable change. He moved uneasily, looked at the closed doors, and again riveted his gaze on Mr. Burton, who did not look at him at all during the narrative, but kept steadily on to the end in a firm, clear tone, low so as not to be overheard outside, but assured and distinct. Having once observed James, I could no longer see any one else. I seemed to see the story reflected in his countenance instead of hearing it. Flushes of heat passed over it, succeeded by an ashy paleness, which deepened into a sickly blue hue, curious to behold. Dark passions swept like shadows over it, and gradually, as the speaker neared the climax of his story, I felt like one who gazes into an open window of the bottomless pit. "Have I told you who it was that hired George Thorley to murder Henry Moreland?" asked Mr. Burton in the pause which followed. It had been taken for granted who the person was, and as he asked the question the eyes of all turned to me, of all except James, who suddenly sprung with a bound against the door opening into the parlor, which was not locked. But another was too quick for him. The powerful hand of the detective was on his shoulder, and as he turned the attempted fugitive full to the light, he said, in words which felt like fire, "It was your nephew, James Argyll." For a moment you might have heard a leaf drop on the carpet. No one spoke or stirred. Then Eleanor arose from her chair, and lifting up her hand, looked with awful eyes at the cowering murderer. Her look blasted him. He had been writhing under Mr. Burton's grasp, but now, as if in answer to her gaze, he said, "Yes, I did it, Eleanor," and dropped to the floor in a swoon. End of Part 2, Chapter 8. Part 2, Chapter 9 of The Dead Letter by Metta Victoria Fuller Victor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Joining the missing links. The scene which transpired in the next few minutes was harrowing. The revulsion of feeling, the shock, the surprise, and the horror were almost too much for human nature to bear. Groan after groan burst from Mr. Argyll, as if his breast were being rent in twain. Mary tottered to her sister and threw herself at her feet, with her head buried in her lap. If she had not been so healthily organized and of such an even temperament, I know not how she would have survived this frightful check to her hopes and affections. It seemed as if Eleanor, who had lived only to suffer for so many weary months, had now more self-possession than any of the others. Her thin, white hand fell softly on her sister's curls with a pitying touch, and after a time she whispered to her some words. My own surprise was nearly as much as anyone's, for although many times I had felt that James was the guilty one, I had always tried to drive away the impression, and had finally almost succeeded. In the meantime, no one went to the unhappy man, who found a temporary relief from shame and despair in insensibility. All recoiled from him as he lay upon the floor. Finally, Mr. Burton forced himself to raise him. Consciousness was returning, and he placed him on the sofa, and gave him a handkerchief wet with cologne. Presently Mary arose from her kneeling position and looked around the room until her glance fell on me, when she came toward me and grasped both my hands, saying, "Richard, I never accused you. I always felt that you were innocent, and always said so. You must forgive the others for my sake. My father and sister will bear me witness that I always defended you from the accusations of one who, it is now proved, sought with inconceivable baseness, to divert suspicion from himself to another." Her voice trembled with scorn. "I never wanted to marry him," she added, bursting into tears, "but they over-persuaded me." "Quiet yourself, sister," said Eleanor, gently arising and approaching us. "We have all wronged you, Richard. I fear beyond forgiveness. Alas, we can now see what a noble enemy you have been." In that moment I felt repaid for all I had suffered, and I said, with joy, "Never an enemy, Miss Argyll, and I forgive you wholly." Then there was another stir. James had risen to slip away from the company, now so distasteful to him, but Mr. Burton again stood between him and egress. As he did so, he said, "Mr. Argyll, it is for you to decide the fate of this miserable man. I have kept all my proceedings a secret from the public. I even allowed George Thorley to remain in Mexico, for I thought your family had already suffered enough, without loading it down with the infamy of your nephew. If you say that he shall go unpunished by the law, I shall abide by your wish. This matter shall be kept by the few who now know it, for your sakes, not for his. I would spare him the death which he deserves, but he must leave the country at once and forever." "Let him go," said his uncle, his back turned upon the murderer, toward whom he would not look. "Go, instantly and forever. And remember, James Argyll, if I ever see your face again, if I ever hear of your being anywhere in the United States, I shall at once cause you to be arrested." "And I the same," added Mr. Burton. "God knows, if it were not for these young ladies, whose feelings are sacred to me, I would not let you off so easily." He opened the door, and James Argyll slunk out into the night, and away, none knew whither, branded, expatriated, and alone. Away, without one look at the fair, beautiful girl who was so soon to have been his bride. Away from the home he had periled his soul to secure. When he had gone, we all breathed more freely. Mr. Burton had yet much to say, for he wished to close this horrible business forever. He took the surgical instrument which we had found in the tree, and fitted it to the piece which had been extracted from the body of the murdered man, and showed the family the initials of George Thorley upon it. He then produced the written confession of Thorley, which we all read for ourselves, but as it contained only in a plain statement the facts already given, I will not repeat them here. He then proceeded with the history of the dead letter, which also he had with him, and which proved to be in the same handwriting as the confession. In speaking of the curious manner in which this document had been lost, to be recovered in the right time by the right person, he seemed to consider it awfully providential. From this he went on with a minute history of all the steps taken by both of us, our journey over the ocean, the wonderful success which waited upon patience, perseverance, and energy, securing the final triumph of justice, and to conclude with, he said, "I owe still a good many explanations both to you, Mr. Argyll, and to Mr. Redfield. I cannot lay before you the thousand subtle threads by which I trace the course of a pursuit like this, and which makes me successful as a detective. But I can account for some things which at times have puzzled both of you. In the first place, there is about me a power not possessed by all. Call it instinct, magnetism, clairvoyancy, or remarkable nervous and mental perception. Whatever it is, it enables me, often, to feel the presence of criminals, as well as of very good persons, poets, artists, or marked temperaments of any kind. The day on which this case was placed before me, it was brought by two young men, your nephew and this person now present. I had not been 10 minutes with them when I began to perceive that the murderer was in the room with me, and before they had left me, I had decided which was the guilty man. But it would have been unpardonable rashness to denounce him without proof. By such a course I would throw him on the defensive, defeat the ends of justice, and overwhelm myself with denunciation. I waited and watched. I put him under surveillance. That night upon which he crossed the Brooklyn ferry to pay the money to the hired assassin, I was upon his track. I heard the angry dismay with which he accused Richard of following him, when the other met him upon this side. It was not very long after I began to investigate the case before he cautiously approached me, as he did you, with hints of the might-be-guilty party. He made me see how much to the interest of his friend Richard it would be if rivals were out of the way, and how desperately that person loved Miss Argyll. Forgive me, friends, for using plain language. The whole truth must be told. But I need not dwell on his method, for you must be familiar with it. I confess that he used consummate tact. If I had not read him from the first, I, too, might have been misled. He was not over-eager in the search for suspected persons, as the guilty almost always are. He did not suspect Miss Sullivan, as Richard did. I favored the pursuit of Miss Sullivan for 2 reasons. The first was to conceal my real suspicions. The next was, after finding her handkerchief in the garden after the flight, and all those really strong grounds for supposing her connected with the murder, I began to think that she was connected with it, through some interest in James Argyll. I did not know but that she might have been attached to him, that the child she cared for might be his. You see, I was totally in the dark as to all the details. I only took it for granted that James was guilty, and had to gather my proofs afterward. It was not until after my interview with Leesy at Moreland Villa that I became convinced she had nothing to do with the murder, and that all her strange proceedings were the result of the grief she felt at the tragic death of one whom she secretly loved. When I had an interview with you on that same afternoon, I saw that James had poisoned your mind with suspicions of Mr. Redfield, for the same reason which had kept me silent so long, that is, that I should eventually undeceive you. I did not defend him, as I otherwise should. Apparently, I allowed the case to drop. It was only that I might follow it undisturbed. I had already fixed upon California as the retreat of the accomplice, and was about to start off in search of him when Richard appeared upon the scene with the dead letter in his hand. From that hour I felt sure of perfect success. My only anxiety was that the marriage should not be consummated, which would seal my mouth, for if Mary had been married on my return, I should have considered it too late to reveal the truth. This made me very uneasy, not only for her sake, but because then I could not clear Mr. Redfield's character to those friends who had cruelly wronged him. I kept my suspicions from him, although he was the partner of my investigations, for I was afraid that his impetuosity might cause him to do something indiscreet, and I did not want the guilty one alarmed until the net was spread for his feet. Tonight, when I came here, I still further carried on my plan of allowing you to remain undecided until the last moment, for I counted on the sudden, overwhelming accusation having the effect to make the murderer confess, which it did. I wished Miss Sullivan to be present, not only to corroborate any points of my testimony in which she might be concerned, but that reparation might also be done her, for we have troubled and frightened her a great deal, poor thing, when her only fault has been too keen a perception of the nobility of that departed martyr, whose memory his friends cherish so sacredly. She has but a brief space to dwell on earth, and I thought it would comfort her to know that no one blames her for the pure devotion which has lighted her soul and consumed it like oil which burns away in perfume. Mr. Burton never meant to be poetical, but his perceptions were of that refined kind that he could not withhold from poor Leesy this little tribute to her noble folly. His words touched Eleanor. She was too high-minded to despise the fruitless offering of another and a humbler woman at the shrine before which she was privileged to minister. I believe in that hour she felt a sister's interest in poor, lowly, but love-exalted Leesy Sullivan. She crossed over, took the wasted hand in her own, and pressed it tenderly. We all now perceived how much this dreadful evening had fatigued the invalid. "She must go to bed at once," said Eleanor. "I will call Nora and have her placed in the room which opens out of ours, Mary." The young ladies retired to give their gentle attention to the sick girl, and both, before they went out, pressed my hand as they said good night. We 3 men remained long, talking over each particular of our strange story, for we could not feel like sleeping. And before we parted for the night, Mr. Argyll had humbled himself to confess that he was led to condemn me without sufficient cause. "I loved you as a son, Richard," he said in a broken voice, "better than I ever loved James, for I was aware that he had many faults of heart and head. And when I was induced to believe you the author of the crime which had broken all our hearts, I was still further downcast. My health has failed, as you see, and I was urgent upon Mary to marry her cousin, for I felt as if she should soon be left friendless, and I wanted the girls to have a protector. I might better have left them to the care of a viper," he added with a shudder. "Poor Mary, dear girl. She was right all the time. She never did love that man, though, of course, she had no idea of the truth. Thank God, it is no worse." I knew he was thinking of the marriage, and I, too, murmured, "Thank God."
"Mr. Argyll," said Mr. Burton, laying his hand on that of the other, "this terrible affair is now brought to a close, as far as it can be. Let me advise you to brood over it as little as possible. Your health is already affected. I acknowledge it is enough to shake one's reason, but, for that, I would bid you to drop it all from your mind, to banish the thought of it, never to refer to it again. You can yet be tolerably happy. A fair future lies before all of you, except dear Miss Eleanor. Adopt Richard as your son. Make him your partner as you first intended. I will give you my warrant for what it is worth that he will relieve you both of business and household cares, and that you will feel, during your declining years, as if you indeed had a son to comfort you." "But I do not believe that Richard would take such a place after what has passed," said Mr. Argyll doubtfully. I hesitated. For a moment pride rebelled, but since all is forgiven, ought it not to be forgotten? When I spoke, it was with heartiness. "If you need a partner in your office, and wish me to take the place, I will do so." "Then the contract is signed," said Mr. Burton almost gaily, "and now I will try to find a bed at the hotel." "Of course you will not," said our host. "This house is yours as much as mine, Mr. Burton, always. How much I thank you for all the time, money, and thought you have lavished in our behalf, I will not try to say tonight. Our gratitude is unspoken because it is boundless." "Don't thank me for following out the instincts of my nature," said the detective, affecting carelessness. And with that we shook Mr. Argyll's hand and retired to the rooms assigned us. In the morning Miss Sullivan was found to be much worse. The journey and the excitement had made her very ill, so that it was impossible for her to return to the city with Mr. Burton. A physician was sent for, who said that she could not live over 2 or 3 days. She heard the sentence with apparent joy, only she begged Mr. Burton to send little Nora up to her on the evening train, that she might see the child before she died. This he promised to do, and to have always an interest in her welfare. She was much affected when he bade her farewell, for he had gained her love and confidence by his manner of treating her. The child came and was tenderly received by the sisters. They were unwearied in their attentions to the sufferer, whose last hours were soothed by their earnest words of hope and comfort. Lucy died with a smile on her face, going out of this world, which had been so cold to one of her impassioned nature, with joy. When I looked at the wasted corpse, I could hardly realize that the fire was out forever, which had so long burned in those wonderful eyes. It was not quenched, it had only been removed to a purer atmosphere. She was buried very quietly, but reverently, on a beautiful winter day. Her little charge was much petted by the young ladies, and as a lady who chanced to see her, learning that she was an orphan, took a fancy to adopt her, they, with Mr. Burton's consent, resigned her to a new mother. I have seen little Nora lately. She is a pretty child, and well cared for. End of Part 2, Chapter 9. Part 2, Chapter 10 of The Dead Letter by Metta Victoria Fuller Victor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The New Life. The winter passed away quietly. The sudden absence of James Argyll caused much harmless gossip in the village. It was reported and generally believed that he had gone abroad on a tour to Egypt because Miss Argyll had jilted him. Fortunately, the arrangements for the wedding were known to but few, the feelings of the family having inclined toward a very quiet affair. The little woman who had prepared the wedding dress was a New York milliner, who probably never learned that the wedding was not consummated. I was very busy in the office. Mr. Argyll's health was poor, and business had accumulated which took most of my time. He wished me to board in his house, but I declined doing so, though, as in the old happy times, I spent nearly all my evenings there. Beyond the first shock, Mary did not seem to suffer from the abrupt termination of an engagement into which she had entered reluctantly. I even believe that she felt very much relieved at not being compelled to marry a cousin for the sake of securing a protector. Her gay laugh soon resumed its sweetness. Her bright loveliness bloomed in the midst of winter, making roses and sunshine in the old mansion. Eleanor seemed to love to see her sister happy, gently encouraging her efforts to drive away the shadow which lingered about the house. Her own sad life must not be permitted to blight the joy of any other. I have said that my feelings toward her had changed from passionate love, through intense sympathy, into affectionate reverence.
I think now that I felt toward her a good deal as Mary did, that nothing we could do for her to show our silent love and sympathy could be too much. A tender regard for her wishes and habits, a deep respect for the manner in which she bore her loss. We did not expect that she would ever again be gay or hopeful, so we did not annoy her with trying to make her so. In the meantime, a great change was taking place in my own nature, of which I was but faintly aware. I only knew that I enjoyed my hard work, that I felt resolute and strong, and that my evenings were pleasant and homelike. Further, I did not question. I wrote to my mother a guarded account of what had occurred, but I was obliged to pay her a flying visit to explain all the facts, for I dared not trust them on paper. Thus the winter glided away into sunshine and spring again. It was the first day which really seemed like spring. It was warm and showery. There was a smell of violets and new grass on the air. I had my office window open, but as the afternoon wore away and the sun shone out after an April sprinkle, I could not abide the dullness of that court of law. I felt those blind motions of the spring which Tennyson attributes to trees and plants, and verily I was in sympathy with nature. I felt verdant, and if the reader thinks that to my discredit, he is at liberty to cherish his opinion. I felt young and happy. Years seemed to have dropped away from me like a mantle of ice, leaving the flowers and freshness to appear. Not knowing whither my fancy would lead me, I walked toward the mansion, and again, as upon that autumn afternoon upon which I first saw Eleanor after her calamity, I turned my steps to the arbor which crowned the slope at the back of the lawn. Thinking of Eleanor, as I saw her then, I entered the place with a light step, and found Mary sitting, looking off on the river with a dreamy face. She blushed when she perceived who had intruded upon her reverie. I saw the warm colors sweep, wave after wave, over the lovely cheek and brow, and I knew instantly the secret it betrayed. I remembered the arms which had once fallen about my neck, the tears which had rained upon my cheek from the eyes of a young girl, the eager voice which had said, "I love you, Richard. I will believe nothing against you." Oh, how sweetly the revelation came to me then! My own heart was fully prepared to receive it. Through months I had been transferring the wealth of young, hopeful love, which craves the bliss of being shared, from the sister who was raised so far above mortal passion, to this dear semblance of her former self. My face must have expressed my happiness, for when I stood over Mary as she sat, and turned her sweet face up toward my own, she gave but one glance before her eyes fell to hide their thought. I kissed her, and she kissed me back again, shyly, timidly. She loved me. I was no longer mateless, but drank the cup of joy which is filled for youth. What happy children we were when, late enough after sunset, we strolled back to the house and went to receive the paternal blessing. I believe that hour when our betrothal was known was the best which had blessed the household since the shadow descended upon it. In June we were married. There was no excuse for delay, and all the friends expressed themselves urgent to have the matter settled. We went on our wedding tour to see my mother, with whom we had a long, delightful visit. 3 years have passed since then, and in that time there have been changes, some of them very sad. Mr. Argyll died about 2 years since, his health never rallying from the shock which it received during those trying times. Since then, we have resided in the old mansion, and Eleanor lives with us. She is a noble woman, one of Christ's anointed, who puts aside her own sorrow to minister to the griefs and sufferings of others. Both Mary and myself defer a great deal to her judgment, which is calm and clear, never clouded by passion, as ours will sometimes be. We feel as if nothing evil could live where Eleanor is. She is the light and blessing of our household. The saddest affliction which has fallen upon us since the loss of our father is the death of Mr. Burton. Alas, he has fallen a victim, at last, to the relentless pursuit of enemies which his course in life raised up about him. The wicked feared him and compassed his destruction. Whether he was murdered by someone whom he had detected in guilt, or by someone who feared the investigations he was making, is not known. He died of poison administered to him in his food. It wrings my heart to think that great and good soul is no more of this world. He was so active, so powerful, of such a genial temperament, it is hard to conceive him dead. We all loved him so much. Oh, if we could discover the cowardly assassin! Sometimes I wonder if it may not have been the man whom he once so mercilessly exposed. God knows, I do not. Attempts upon his life were many times made, but his acute perceptions had always, hitherto, warned him of danger. Lenore is with us. We shall keep her until some lover comes in the future to rob us of her. She is a rare child, almost a woman now, as talented as her father and exceedingly lovely. At present she is overwhelmed with grief, and clings to Eleanor, who is her best comforter. In our love for her, we try to repay some of the debt we owe her father. End of Part 2, Chapter 10. End of The Dead Letter by Metta Victoria Fuller Victor. Writing under the pseudonym Seeley Regester.